The man in the doorway didn't knock. He just stood there, filling the frame, one hand gripping the leash so tight his knuckles had gone white, and he looked at Tess Garvey the way people look at furniture they're about to move out of the way. "I need someone who knows what they're doing," he said. "Not a student." Tess was 31 years old. She had been a registered veterinary technician at Ridgeline Animal Hospital in Sudbury, Ontario for 6 years. She had a framed certificate on the wall behind her that said exactly that, though she noticed Colonel Okafor's eyes didn't travel that far. What his eyes did travel to was the dog. The animal was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 80 pounds, named Bravo, according to the intake form that Okafor had filled out in the waiting room, in handwriting so precise it looked machine-printed. Bravo stood at attention beside his handler, not pulling, not sniffing the floor the way most dogs did when they came through that door. He just stood there, ears forward, tracking everything in the room with those amber eyes. The kind of dog that made you understand immediately that this was not a pet. "I'm not a student," Tess said. "I'm the senior tech on shift. Dr. Arsenault is tied up with a surgery right now, but I can get the initial assessment started." Okafor's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes did. A small recalibration, the kind Tess had seen 100 times. The moment a person decided to let her proceed, not because they respected her judgment, but because they had no better option at hand. "He bit the last person who tried to examine him," Okafor said. "Civilian vet in Petawawa. Put her hand out wrong." "Okay." Tess kept her voice flat and even. "Thank you for telling me. I'm not telling you as a warning. I'm telling you so you know what you're dealing with." He said it the way people say things they believe are clarifications but are actually corrections. Bravo isn't aggressive. He's protective. There's a difference. He reads threat levels. If he reads you as a threat, he will act on it. He doesn't wait for permission. Tess looked at the dog. Bravo looked back at her. "How long has he been limping?" she asked. A beat of silence. Okafor hadn't expected her to redirect that fast. 3 days? Front left? Yes, any swelling you can see? Some, around the carpus. She nodded slowly. She didn't move toward Bravo yet. She just stayed where she was, slightly angled, not making direct eye contact with the animal, letting him study her the way he needed to. This was the part most people skipped, the part that felt like doing nothing but was actually the most important part. "You can take a seat if you'd like," she told Okafor. "There's a chair just outside the door." He didn't move. "I'll stay. That's fine. Just if you stay, I need you to step back a little and stay quiet. Your energy affects his readings." The look he gave her then could have curdled milk. But he stepped back. 2 feet, maybe. His jaw was set like a man who had swallowed something he objected to. Tess crouched down, not suddenly. She sort of folded herself toward the floor in stages slowly, the way you would if you were just tired and needed to sit. She kept her gaze on the middle distance, not on Bravo. She rested her hands on her knees, palms up, open, utterly still. The room was quiet except for the ventilation system humming and the faint sound of Dr. Arsenault's voice somewhere down the hall talking through a procedure. Tess waited. She was very good at waiting. Bravo's ears shifted. One tilted slightly forward, the other stayed where it was. He lowered his nose an inch, 2 inches, sampling the air in her direction. His weight transferred, barely perceptible, but Tess caught it, from his hind legs toward his front. He was thinking about coming to her. "Don't," Okafor said, very quietly. Not to Tess, to the dog. Bravo stopped. Immediately, completely, the way military-trained animals do when a command lands, not reluctantly, not after a moment's deliberation, but as if the decision had never existed in the first place. Tess didn't react to the command. She stayed where she was, hands open, waiting. After a moment, she said, still not looking at Okafor, "What was his handler's name? Before you." A long silence, longer than she'd expected. "Sergeant Luke Tremblay," Okafor said finally. "He was Kia, Kandahar, 14 months ago." Tess absorbed that. She didn't say she was sorry, because it wasn't the moment for that, and she sensed Okafor would receive it as pity rather than acknowledgement. She just sat with it for a second, let it settle into the room. "And Bravo was with him when it happened?" "Yes." "Has it been assessed since then, behaviorally?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "He was. The assessment recommended retirement from active service." Okafor's voice was careful now, not defensive exactly, but close. "I disagreed with the assessment." Tess looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. There was something in those amber eyes that she couldn't have put into words precisely, but that she recognized. She had seen it in animals that had been through things their bodies remembered even when the immediate danger had long since passed. "He came to live with you," she said. It wasn't a question. He needed someone who understood the work. Tess nodded once. She shifted her weight slightly, just moving her left knee an inch or two to the side, and Bravo's ears tracked the motion. She said, very quietly, not to either of them in particular, "His handler died. He survived." And then a stranger took over the leash. The room was very still. She wasn't sure what made her say what she said next. It wasn't planned. It came from somewhere in her chest that she didn't have a clinical name for. She looked at Bravo and she spoke to him directly in the same low, even voice. "You did your job. You did it right. What happened wasn't a failure on your part." Okafor made a sound, not quite a word, a short exhale like he'd been about to say something and reconsidered. Bravo walked toward Tess. Not slowly, not cautiously, just walked, the way a dog walks toward someone they've decided to trust, which is different from the way they approach strangers. Direct. Deliberate. He stopped when his nose was 6 inches from her open palm, sniffed her once, and then pressed the side of his head into her hand. Tess let out a slow breath. She brought her hand up gently and laid it along the side of his skull, behind the ear, and just held it there for a moment. Then she looked up at Okafor. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do since he'd walked through the door. It had opened, just slightly, just around the eyes, and for a second he looked less like a colonel and more like a man standing in a veterinary clinic in Sudbury who was holding on to a dog because the dog was the last thread connecting him to someone he couldn't talk about in rooms like this one. "Let me take a look at that leg," Tess said softly. She never did raise her voice the whole time she worked. She moved carefully, talking to Bravo in low, steady tones as she palpated the joint, checked the range of motion, assessed the swelling. He let her. He didn't stiffen, didn't pull away. When she pressed a tender spot and he shifted, she paused, waited for him to settle, then continued. The whole examination took 22 minutes. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at her notes. "Carpal hyperextension," she said. "Mild to moderate. It's consistent with impact stress, the kind of thing you see in working dogs after sustained high-activity deployment. Not a fracture. He'll need rest, a supportive brace, and probably a round of anti-inflammatories to bring that swelling down. I'd like Dr. Arsenault to confirm with x-rays before we brace, but my honest read is that he's going to be fine." She looked up. Okafor was still standing where she'd left him, 2 feet back from where he'd been at the start, and he was looking at her with an expression she didn't entirely know how to read. "Fine," she said again, more gently. "He just needs to be taken care of." Something crossed Okafor's face then, quick, almost imperceptible, and it might have been relief, or it might have been something older and heavier than relief. He nodded once, the same way he'd probably nodded at briefings, at orders, at information that required acknowledgement before action. "Thank you," he said. His voice was careful, the way people are careful when something has moved them and they're not ready to be seen being moved. Tess stood up, brushing her knees. "I'll get the intake paperwork updated and flag it for Dr. Arsenault. We can probably have the x-rays done within the hour." She paused. "He did really well." "He always does," Okafor said, and then, like it was being extracted from somewhere deep and reluctant, "He's a good dog." It was the first time he'd said anything about Bravo that sounded like love rather than capability. Bravo, for his part, had settled beside Tess's feet, not leaning on her, not demanding anything, just there, in the easy, undemanding way dogs are when they've decided a place is safe. Okafor looked at that, and something in his posture changed. The military straight spine didn't soften exactly, but it shifted, a millimeter, maybe 2, away from the rigid holding pattern it had been in since he walked through the door. She left them there for a moment while she went to update the chart, and when she came back, Okafor was crouched on the floor beside Bravo, one hand resting on the dog's flank, talking to him in a low voice she couldn't quite hear from the doorway. She knocked lightly on the open door frame so she wouldn't startle them. Okafor looked up. "Sorry," he said. He started to stand. "Don't be," Tess said. "Take your time." She stayed in the doorway another moment, not intruding, just present. There was something she'd learned in 6 years of this work, that the threshold between an animal and its person was sometimes the only honest space either of them had, the only place where the military bearing or the professional armor or whatever other thing people wore out in the world wasn't quite enough to hold together. Animals didn't care about rank. They didn't care about whether your face was doing the right thing or your voice had the right edge of authority. They just cared about the truth of you, whatever that was. Bravo had read Okafor's truth the day they met, she suspected, and had been carrying it with him ever since. She turned and went to prep the X-ray room. Dr. Arsenault came out of surgery 20 minutes later, still gloved and carrying the specific focused look of a man who had been doing something technically demanding and was now re-entering the civilian world. He was 62, with a silver beard he kept trimmed to a length that suggested he had opinions about it, and he'd been practicing veterinary medicine in Sudbury for 30 years. He trusted Tess's assessments completely, which he demonstrated by reading her notes for exactly 45 seconds, and then saying, "Let's get those X-rays." He stood against the wall, arms at his sides, watching as Arsenault positioned Bravo on the table. And as Tess held the animal still with the particular kind of steadiness that wasn't restraint, but felt like reassurance. Bravo stayed calm through the whole thing, eyes moving occasionally to Okafor, then back to Tess, triangulating his 2 points of reference. The X-rays confirmed what Tess had said. Mild hyperextension, no fracture, some soft tissue inflammation. Arsenault explained the course of treatment while Tess wrote it up in the chart, and when he was done, Okafor asked 3 precise, technical questions, the kind that told you he had read about this already, had probably read about it extensively, just to make sure he understood what Bravo was dealing with. "The prognosis for full recovery?" he asked. "Very good," Arsenault said, "assuming he rests properly. No high-impact activity for 4 to 6 weeks. I know that's not easy for a dog that's used to working." "He's supposed to be retired," Okafor said. There was a beat. "Well," Arsenault said, with the careful neutrality of a man who understood he was not equipped to address whatever was actually being said, "then this is good timing. Time to slow down." Okafor nodded. He looked at Bravo, who was sitting on the table with the dignified patience of a dog who had been through significantly more disorienting things than a veterinary examination, and something in Okafor's expression shifted again, that same fractional opening Tess had seen earlier. "He saved 3 soldiers," Okafor said, to no one in particular. 2 in Kandahar, 1 in a compound in Panjwai. "Found an IED that our equipment missed." His handler, Tremblay, he said afterward that Bravo wasn't doing his job in that moment. He said Bravo was just being himself, that he had always been able to feel when something was wrong, before there was any evidence of it. Nobody spoke for a moment. "Some dogs are like that," Tess said quietly. She wasn't looking at Okafor. She was checking the brace fitting, hands moving carefully around Bravo's carpus. "They read things the rest of us miss." Tremblay said the same thing. Okafor's voice was even, controlled the way a person's voice gets when control is what's holding them upright. He said Bravo picked people, that when Bravos accepted someone, it meant something. Tess finished the fitting. She looked up. Okafor was looking at her steadily. "He picked you," he said, in about 4 minutes. "It took him 3 weeks to accept me." Tess held his gaze. She didn't know what to say to that. Exactly. She said he trusted that you needed him. That's different from just accepting someone. Okafor blinked. Once, slowly. She hadn't planned to say it. It had just come out, the way truths sometimes come out in rooms where the pretense of getting through the day has briefly, unexpectedly, failed. She went back to the brace fitting. Her hands didn't shake. She had learned a long time ago not to let her hands shake when she was feeling something she hadn't anticipated. They sent Bravo home that afternoon with a brace, a week's worth of anti-inflammatories, a printed care sheet that Tess had customized to account for the specific exercise restrictions relevant to his training, and a follow-up appointment for 2 weeks out. Okafor stood at the reception desk, reading the care sheet with the same precision he'd applied to everything else since he'd walked through the door that morning. Tess was behind the desk, finishing notes in the chart. Between them, Bravo sat at Okafor's feet, new brace on, already seeming indifferent to it, because Bravo was that kind of dog. "You're good at this," Okafor said without looking up from the care sheet. "I've been doing it a long time." "No." He looked up then. "I mean, you're technically proficient. Anyone with enough training can be technically proficient. I mean, you're good at reading what's actually happening in the room, what's actually being asked." He said it like he was noting a tactical advantage. That's a different thing. Tess looked at him across the desk. "Thank you," she said. "It's an observation." but his voice was slightly different than it had been when he'd made observations earlier in the day. She handed him the appointment card for the follow-up. Their hands didn't touch when she passed it across the desk. There was a precise, professional quarter-inch of air between the card and his fingers, but he held the card for a second before he put it in his jacket pocket, as though he was reading something on it that wasn't there. Garvey, he said, reading her name tag. Not colonel to civilian, not even officer to enlisted. Just reading her name. How long have you been here? 6 years. Did you always want to do this? It was such an un-Okafor question that she actually paused before answering. My family had dogs when I was growing up. Outside of Timmins, we weren't a family that took animals to the vet. But there was one dog, Shepherd Mix. She got sick one winter, and my mom drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to get her to a clinic in North Bay. She hadn't told this story to anyone in the clinic before. She wasn't sure why she was telling it now, except that Okafor was looking at her like he was actually listening, which was rarer than it should have been. The vet there, her name was Dr. Poirier. She worked on that dog for 4 hours. She saved her, and afterward she sat with us in the waiting room for 20 minutes, not because she had to, because she wanted to make sure we were okay too. I was 11. I thought that was the most important job I'd ever seen. Okafor listened to all of that. He nodded when she finished, slowly, like he was filing it somewhere. Tremblay was from Timmins, he said. Tess stared at him. He talked about it a lot. His family had a camp on Frederick House Lake. He said the winters were. Okafor started again. He said you knew who a person was by how they behaved in a Timmins winter. He said people who couldn't survive that kind of cold didn't last long, but the ones who did were the kind you wanted beside you. The reception desk felt suddenly very thin between them, like it wasn't quite the barrier it was supposed to be. I'm sorry, Tess said, and this time she meant it as more than condolence. She meant it the way you mean it when someone has shown you the shape of a loss and you can see how much of them it took with it. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not quite grief, because she suspected Okafor had moved grief to a room he didn't open often, but something adjacent to it, something that knew where the door was. He would have liked you, Okafor said finally. He would have said, and here, for the first time since he'd walked through her door that morning, something in his voice almost gave way. He would have said that Bravo knew. Bravo, at his feet, looked up at both of them with the patient, ancient attention of an animal that had seen too much and survived it anyway. He came back 2 weeks later for the follow-up. Bravo's gait had already improved. The swelling was mostly gone. Arsenault said the healing was progressing better than expected, which Tess had suspected it would be, because Bravo was that kind of dog too, the kind that, once he'd decided to let himself be taken care of, committed to it completely. Okafor arrived on time. He always arrived on time. This was his second visit, and she already knew this about him with the certainty of something observed rather than inferred. He wasn't in uniform today. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a gray fleece, and he looked younger without the uniform, or maybe just less armored, which amounted to the same thing. He handed Tess a small bag when he came to the desk. Inside was a jar of maple butter from a place on Elgin Street and a card that said, in that machine-precise handwriting, thank you, Garvey. Okafor. She almost laughed, almost, because the formality of it was somehow the most human thing he'd done yet. You didn't have to do this, she said. I know. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. Bravo chose the gift too, technically. He put his nose on the bag in the store. Tess did laugh then, a real one, quick and unguarded, and Okafor watched it happen with an expression she would have struggled to name. Something that was not quite a smile, but was the thing a face does when it wants to smile and isn't entirely sure it's allowed. That tracks, she said. She set the bag aside, and they walked together to the exam room. Bravo between them, not pulling toward either of them, but somehow equidistant, as if he had decided a long time ago that this was the correct formation. The follow-up was straightforward. Arsenault cleared Bravo for light activity, gave Okafor a schedule for gradually reintroducing exercise, and pronounced the case textbook in terms of recovery. Okafor shook Arsenault's hand with genuine warmth, which Tess filed away as information. Afterward, in the hallway, Okafor stood beside Bravo for a moment with the care sheet in his hand and said, without particular preamble, I've been thinking about what you said, about Bravo trusting that I needed him. Tess waited. I think you were right. I brought him home because I told myself it was what Tremblay would have wanted, that I was honoring the unit, honoring the partnership. But I think the truth is, he stopped. Started again, like a man who had prepared a route and was now deviating from it deliberately. The truth is that after Kandahar, I needed something to be responsible for. Something that needed me to be okay even when I wasn't. And Bravo had lost his handler, and I had lost. He didn't finish that. He didn't need to. So we were useful to each other. She thought about all the ways people found their way to the same necessary things by different paths, the ones they admitted and the ones they didn't. That's not a lesser reason, she said. No? Needing someone isn't a lesser reason than choosing them. Usually it's the same thing, from different directions. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the floor. Bravo leaned lightly against his leg, not demanding, not asking, just present. The way dogs are when they've decided the weight of them is needed. Tremblay used to say that Bravo was the best judge of character he'd ever met, Okafor said. I used to tell him that was because Bravo couldn't talk, so he couldn't lie. And now? Tess said. Okafor looked up. There was something in his face that was no longer the expression he'd walked in with the first day. That flat, closed, careful arrangement of features that said nothing would surprise him and nothing would reach him. This was different. Smaller. More honest. Now I think maybe Tremblay had a point, he said. He said goodbye to her the way he'd thanked her. Carefully, precisely, like a man who was new to certain feelings and wanted to handle them correctly. He walked out through the front door, Bravo at his side, moving with a steadiness that wasn't quite the same as the steadiness he'd walked in with 5 weeks ago. Less like a man bracing for impact. More like a man who had recently decided, tentatively and with appropriate reservations, that not everything was going to hit. Tess stood at the front window for a moment after they'd gone, watching Okafor open the back door of his truck for Bravo, watching the dog jump up with the particular careful economy of an animal that was healing and knew it, watching Okafor close the door and stand with his hand on it for a second before he walked around to the driver's side. Marisol, the receptionist, appeared at Tess's elbow. Military guys coming back in 6 weeks, right? For the final check? 6 weeks, Tess confirmed. Marisol glanced at her sidelong with the slightly calculating warmth of a woman who had worked reception for 11 years and believed strongly in the diagnostic value of her own observations. He brought you maple butter. He brought the clinic maple butter. The card, said Garvey. Tess turned away from the window. Go back to your desk. Marisol went back to her desk, visibly satisfied with the whole interaction. Tess picked up the chart for the next patient and walked back down the hallway, past the framed certificate, past the door Okafor had stood in that morning 5 weeks ago when he'd looked at her like furniture. She thought about Bravo walking toward her across that floor. Deliberate, unhurried, as if he'd already decided before he started moving. Animals don't perform trust. They don't extend it because it's polite or because the situation requires it. They give it or they don't, and when they do, it means something exact and unrepeatable about the person on the receiving end. She had thought, in that moment, that she was the one doing the reading, that she was the one assessing and responding and making the space safe enough for the animal to choose it. But Bravo had been doing the same thing, had done it in 4 minutes, apparently. She wondered, not for the first time and not with any particular urgency, what it was he'd read.